Destruction and creation are the same thing after all. The mighty always fall. And destroy something beautiful.
This is the grave of Grace Yorston, a 27-year-old woman who in the late 1890s lived with her father James and had a brother and two sisters, Sophia and Maud. They hailed from the Brisbane suburb of Woolloongabba on the south side of the Brisbane River.
And this area is the grave of a young man named Henry Jarman, or Harry as he was more commonly known. Well, at least it used to be here. It was taken away when the Brisbane City Council had a clean-up of old graves that had become dilapidated in 1974. Now, this old photo is all that remains of the Jarman plot. Like most other days, on Thursday, February 13, 1896, both Harry and Grace went off to work in Brisbane City. But that night, neither of them returned to their homes. They'd become victims of the worst river tragedy Australia has ever seen. By mid-afternoon that Thursday, the city was experiencing a typical Brisbane midsummer's day, sweltering and almost unbearably steamy. And to make matters worse, the river was in flood. The catchments had received another 30 millimetres or so of rain in the past 24 hours, increasing the deluge of rubbish washed down the stream to threaten the temporary section of the Victoria Bridge with collapse. The patch-up job had served the city well since the bridge had been partially swept away in the flood of 1893. But now it had been closed, and for Grace, getting to the other side and her home meant catching one of the small steamers that had been brought in to fill the gap.
By just after 5, Grace was making her way towards Queen's Wharf, the place from where those ferries were plying back and forth across the river. Whether she was uncertain as to where the ferry operations were taking place, or was not in a hurry to get home, we don't know. But that she was walking slowly towards the wharf may well have altered her destiny. The Victoria Bridge closure had left hundreds of people stranded on one side of the river or the other. Grace clearly wasn't alone as she made her way home that Thursday evening.
If you lived in Brisbane in the 1890s, there's one name you would almost certainly know. That name was Jarman, the family that operated the biggest and best saddlery in town. The man who owned it was Richard Jarman, something of a controversial character who wasn't shy in trumpeting his successes. When he won 17 first prizes for 17 exhibits at the local show known in Brisbane as the Ekka, he burst into print in the Brisbane Courier saying, "Biggest score on record. What is likely to stand as the permanent record for all time has just been made by R.E. Jarman, Premier Saddler, who was awarded 17 first prizes for 17 exhibits. This requires no comment further than to remark the impossibility of beating this score." Another of the family who was part of this remarkable effort was the son of Richard Jarman, Harry, who managed their Edward Street store. Like Grace, Harry, who was accompanied by his aunt, would need to find an alternative to the Victoria Bridge to get home that afternoon, so also made his way towards Queen's Wharf on the city side of the river, almost directly across from where the Wheel of Brisbane operates today. Waiting there for its next passengers was the 17-metre-long steam-powered tug, the Pearl. The destination on the south side of the river, Musgrave Wharf, was just 4 blocks or so away from Musgrave Park, which is still there today. This old photograph gives a glimpse of what the area was like, and it was often crowded with large vessels and extremely hectic. The wharf, as you can see, is gone. The journey that afternoon in 1896 was only about 300 metres as the crow flies, but on that day, because of a shortage of wharf space for large vessels, there was an added difficulty. Anchored in the river were 2 bigger craft, the Royal Mail ship Normanby and the state government yacht Lucinda. The Pearl and 2 other small ships, Alice and Young Matt, which were taking passengers back and forward across the river, had to negotiate their way between the two larger vessels. It was no easy task in a river that was raging. When it again became the turn of the heavily but not overladen Pearl to navigate the river hazards, the turbulent water and those two larger vessels, those who were on board say as she approached the rear of the Normanby to avoid a collision, the Pearl's captain called for the power to be reduced. As a result, the Pearl was swept downstream and driven against the anchor chains of the Lucinda. The power of the river was so great that she was forced up the chain, capsized and immediately began to break up. The estimate was that there were between 80 and 100 people on board, and they were all thrown into the murky torrent. Harry and Grace were amongst them. One report says that on the previous trip across the river, the Pearl had actually struck the anchor chain of the Lucinda, and the captain made comment to the effect that he wouldn't try to navigate between the vessels again. But he had, and now it was desperation time for those in the water. The next day, the headlines told the dreadful story, but there were also amazing accounts of survival, many of them just a matter of luck. One man told the story of his desperate leap from the Pearl in the general direction of the Lucinda and was amazed and particularly grateful when he landed on his feet on the ship's deck. We also now know what happened to young Harry Jarman travelling on the Pearl with his aunt.
Somehow, Harry managed to get hold of a lifebuoy when the ship went over, probably thrown from the south bank by onlookers. But he gave it to his aunt saying,
"Here, you take this and save yourself. All will be right."
His aunt was saved, but it was the last seen of Harry.
Right here where the Pearl disappeared, there was tragedy at every turn. Another man, a resident of Manly with a large family, drowned on the way home from his wife's funeral. And while everything that could float was thrown into the river and every boat in the vicinity went to the rescue, it's believed that more than half the number of passengers on the Pearl perished.
At the magisterial inquiry that followed the tragedy, evidence was given by a young man, William Woodcroft, who said if Grace had been walking a little more quickly, she may have caught the boat from which William had just alighted, the young Matt. Instead, as we now know, it had departed for the south side and Grace boarded the Pearl. The papers reported Miss Grace Yorston, who was expected home last evening, has not been heard of up to this morning at 8:30, and it is feared that she may have been one of the unfortunates who were on board the Pearl. By Monday, 4 days later, it was still unclear how many people had lost their lives because no one knew exactly how many people were on board. Grace and Harry's names appeared in the dreadful list of those who perished, but bodies and effects were still being found. One young lady, a Miss Maggie McGee, was found washed up on Bribie Island, 50 kilometres north of where the tragedy took place. The Telegraph also reported 2 hats belonging to passengers on the Pearl were washed up on Nudgee Beach.
Also appearing in Monday's paper was this notice of Grace's funeral to be held at South Brisbane Cemetery that very afternoon. The shattered wreckage of the Pearl was eventually found about 50 metres downstream from the ferry shed that stood at the end of Ernest Street and dragged from the river bottom in a terrible state after the floodwater subsided. No one can be absolutely sure how many died, but it's believed 43 people were rescued, 28 bodies were recovered, but Emergency Management Australia estimates that there are at least another 20 that were never recovered. The master of the Pearl, Captain James Chard, survived but had his qualifications cancelled after the Marine Board inquiry. Before long, the Victoria Bridge was rebuilt and life in the city centre went back to normal. The sinking of the Pearl remains the worst river disaster in Australia, which history will always remember. Hopefully Harry's act of bravery will go down in history as well, and we will remember Grace and the sliding door moment that changed her destiny.